How did the Vikings sleep during the polar night? None of us would survive in such conditions, but the Vikings somehow managed to do so. Let's find out how. We tend to think of the polar night as something poetic, but for the Vikings, it was an annual battle for survival. It was an enemy made up of cold and darkness that besieged their homes for months on end. In a world without central heating or electricity, sleep was the most dangerous time of day. Every night was a test that required engineering rather than brute force. Their longhouses were transformed into besieged fortresses, arcs defending against the icy ocean of darkness. Every detail of their daily life was subordinated to one goal: to live to see the dawn. Inside these smoky halls, an invisible battle for every degree of warmth was unfolding. The stakes in this battle were extremely high. Watch the video to the end to find out how the Vikings managed not only to survive, but to live fully in a world plunged into darkness, and what one secret of their sleeping quarters saved them from frostbite. What if I told you that everything you believed about Viking houses was incomplete? They weren't just log cabins. They were complex, semi-underground survival machines built on the principle of a thermos. The Viking built his house not on the ground, but in the ground. The walls of a longhouse were not just wooden. Often they consisted of 2 rows of logs or stones, the space between which was tightly packed with earth. But the main secret was the outer shell. The house was almost completely covered with thick layers of turf. These turf bricks were laid in several layers, reaching a thickness of 1 meter or more. This living wall had phenomenal insulating properties. In winter, the outer layer of turf and snow froze, creating a hard, windproof crust. This crust, like armor, protected the inner, drier layers of turf from the wind and cold. The house itself was often deliberately oriented in the direction of the prevailing winds. The narrow end took the brunt of the elements. The long, sloping roof, also covered with turf, allowed snow to accumulate. This snowdrift, which completely covered the house, became an additional, ideal insulator. Inside this structure, which resembled a hill more than a building, life unfolded. The wooden frame inside was only a skeleton, and the real protection was the earth, grass, and snow. Low and narrow doors were the only openings in this fortress. They were always equipped with thick wooden shutters. This minimized the loss of precious heat when entering or leaving. Thus, the longhouse was not just a dwelling. It was an engineering masterpiece, a passive heating system where every element was designed to retain heat. The design was so effective that the heat from the fire and the bodies of dozens of inhabitants could maintain a positive temperature inside when a blizzard was raging outside. This living wall technology was ingenious in its simplicity. What modern insulation materials do you think are based on the same principle of multi-layering and air entrapment? Share your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to our channel. Want to know the secret that was more important than a sword and shield? The secret without which no warrior, no child, no settlement at the edge of the world could survive? It was fire that burned for weeks, sometimes months. At the heart of every longhouse burned the langeld, the long fire of the Vikings. It was not a fireplace in the usual sense. Langeld was an elongated, shallow trench running along the entire central axis of the house. In large halls, the length of such a hearth could reach tens of meters. The flame in it did not just provide warmth, it organized life. Everything that happened under the roof revolved around this pulsating living light. This shape was not chosen by chance. In longhouses, where families, workers, guests, and even livestock lived, even heat distribution was required. The long hearth radiated heat throughout the entire length of the room, turning a cold, windy space into a warm refuge. People could sit around it, cook, repair weapons, or simply sit in silence, listening to the crackling logs. Fire was the true heart of the home, not only symbolically, but also physically. It provided light when endless northern nights stood outside the windows. It provided warmth when the winds from the sea pierced through. It provided food. After all, pots of meat and soup boiled above it. The extinction of the fire was perceived as a disaster, almost like death. Maintaining the langhouses was a matter of honor. Women or older family members were responsible for it. They made sure that the coals never went out. Sometimes the fire burned continuously throughout the winter, for several months in a row. This required an incredible amount of fuel. Firewood was rare in northern countries, especially in Iceland or on the coasts of Norway, where trees hardly grew. Therefore, the Vikings used everything that burned: roots washed up by the sea, driftwood, dry shrubs, but most often peat. It was harvested in the summer, dried in layers, and used as fuel in the winter. Dry peat smoldered slowly and evenly, giving off steady, dense heat. Its smell, mixed with smoke and sea salt, was an integral part of life in a northern home. The hearth was lined with stones that heated up from the flames during the day and gave off heat at night, creating a feeling of constant warmth. Sometimes wooden grates or low sides were installed along the hearth to prevent the coals from spilling out. The floor of the house was earthen, trampled by feet and animal hooves, so sparks posed no danger. Benches and benches covered with skins stood along the walls. Women sat on them, spinning and sewing, while men repaired weapons, sharpened knives, and wove nets. Everything was lit by the fire in the center. The flames flickered on their faces, making them look alive, warm, almost sacred. But this system had a weak point: smoke. The house did not have the usual chimneys. The ceiling was high, and the smoke simply rose upward, gathering in a thick cloud under the roof. Through special openings in the ridge, it gradually escaped outside. In winter, they were only partially open to preserve heat, and a thick smoky curtain always hung inside. To an outsider, such a room would seem suffocating. Eyes watered, clothes were saturated with the smell of burning, and hair smelled of smoke. But for the inhabitants of the longhouse, it was the smell of home, the smell of life. They had been accustomed to it since childhood and even found comfort in it. And yet the smoke was not only a problem, it was a blessing. It protected the turf and straw roof from rotting, repelled insects, and dried the wood, protecting it from mold. Thanks to it, Viking houses could stand for decades. Langeld was more than just a hearth. It was a symbol of the clan. When going on a campaign, men took embers from their home fires with them, as a piece of their home and protection from cold nights. If the house was destroyed, the most important thing was to save the fire in order to breathe life into a new dwelling. So yes, swords and shields protected the body, but Langeld protected life itself. Without it, there would be no warmth, no food, no home. And the smoke that settled under the roof hid another secret. Want to know how the Vikings used it to preserve meat, protect wood, and even purify the air? And why, despite the constant smoke, they didn't suffocate in their sleep? All this is in the next chapter. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of survival in a longhouse. We are used to thinking of smoke as an unconditional evil that must be eliminated. But for the Vikings, smoke from the hearth was as much a tool as an axe or a hammer. In the roof, directly above the long hearth, there was an opening called a liore. It was not just a hole, but a regulated ventilation system. It could be partially or completely covered with a special wooden shield or frame, covered with a translucent material. This damper was controlled by a long pole. The Vikings did not open it completely so as not to let all the heat escape. They covered it just enough to create draft but keep the smoke under the ceiling. The warm smoke circulated slowly in the upper part of the hall before finding its way out. This smoke cap served several important functions. First, it created an additional warm layer of air under the roof itself, slowing down heat loss. Second, and most importantly, the smoke was a preservative. Wood and peat smoke contains creosote and other substances. These substances, settling on wooden beams and rafters, protected them from rotting in a damp climate. The smoke literally smoked the house from the inside. This was necessary in conditions where the wood was constantly exposed to moisture from people's breath and evaporation. Without this smoke treatment, the roof would have rotted away in a few years. Moreover, the smoke effectively repelled insects and small pests. It created an environment unsuitable for their life in wooden structures. Meat and fish were often hung on beams under the roof to dry. The smoke, which constantly fumigated them, preserved the food, creating reserves for the winter. The fire simultaneously heated, cooked, and preserved supplies. But how did people not suffocate? All living and sleeping areas were located below, along the walls. The smoke, being hot, accumulated at the top, under the roof ridge. People lived and slept in a layer of relatively clean air. It was an ingenious vertical division of space. Below was life. Above was the technical, smoke-preserving zone. Guess where Vikings actually slept? Not in separate beds, as in our homes, and not on straw scattered on the floor. Their sleeping system was thought out to the smallest detail and literally built into the very architecture of their dwellings. Sleep was not just rest, but part of the overall rhythm of life, organized around the hearth and long walls. Along both sides of the longhouse, a huge rectangular house with one large room, were wide wooden platforms. These platforms were called pallor and served as both benches and beds. During the day, people sat on them, ate, mended clothes, spun wool, and repaired nets. At night, these same areas turned into a common sleeping area. The Vikings did not waste space. Every item was functional. Every meter of the house was used wisely. The pallors were raised above the ground by 30 or even 50 centimeters. It seemed like a small thing, but it was of great importance. In the cold northern climate, this height saved lives. The earthen floor in a longhouse was always cold and often damp. Heavy air, saturated with moisture and cold, settled at the bottom. Sleeping on the ground meant waking up frozen and with a cold. But on a raised platform, it was a completely different story. The heat from the central hearth rose and lingered at human body level. Thus, those sleeping on the platforms were in the most comfortable zone, between the icy air near the floor and the hot layer of smoke under the roof. This simple but ingenious solution worked like a natural heating system. The pallors were made of thick boards, usually spruce or pine. They were wide enough for several people to sleep side by side. In wealthy homes, each family could have its own separate section of the platform. In poorer communities, people slept more closely together, covering themselves with shared skins. During the day, these platforms were used as benches. Women sat closer to the light, doing needlework. Men sat closer to the hearth, where it was warmer. Children ran along the narrow passage between the platforms, and the elderly lay covered with blankets, watching life go by. By evening, the whole space was plunged into semi-darkness, and people, without taking off their clothes, simply lay down in the same places where they had sat during the day. Chests, tools, spare clothes, and dishes were stored under the platforms. This space served as a kind of built-in closet. Sometimes even valuable items were kept there: weapons, jewelry, amulets. The Vikings left no empty spaces. Everything had a meaning and a purpose. The walls behind the platforms were often covered with boards to insulate those sleeping from the cold and damp. Dry moss could be laid between the wall and the paneling to serve as natural insulation. Thus, a person lying on the pallor was protected from the cold from below, behind, and partially from above, if there was a canopy or fabric curtain nearby. The floor, on the other hand, was a technical area. This is where people walked, chopped wood, cleaned fish, and tended to animals. This is where there was noise and soot, and where sparks flew from the hearth. But life, warm, quiet, homely, flowed on these raised wooden platforms along the walls. This created a surprisingly rational system, where architecture literally adapted to human needs. Everything was simple, but thought out to the smallest detail. The Vikings did not build for beauty, they built for survival. And yet the question arises, how did they turn these hard boards into a place where one could truly rest? After all, even the strongest warrior could not endure long nights on bare wood. What did they cover these platforms with? What did they use instead of mattresses and pillows? How did they keep warm under the icy roof? We will explore this in the next chapter. We will look beneath the surface and discover how the Vikings created comfort for themselves in the harsh north. Turning a hard wooden platform into a place to sleep was an art in itself. The Viking bed was based on accessible and effective natural materials. The main task was to create a multi-layered cocoon that would retain heat. A thick layer of insulating material was laid on the bare boards of the palara. Most often, this was dry straw, hay, or dried moss. This elastic layer served as a mattress and the first line of defense against the cold coming from the boards. Processed skins were laid on top of this mattress. These could be thick sheepskins laid with the wool facing up. They created a soft and warm surface. In wealthier homes, wild animal skins were used. Thick, dense furs served as luxurious and incredibly warm bedding. They prevented body heat from escaping. The sleeper never went to bed undressed. Vikings slept in their undergarments or even in light outer clothing. This was another layer of insulation. Blankets served as the main covering. They were very different from ours. They were heavy pieces of vadmal, a very dense felted woolen fabric. This fabric was practically windproof and retained heat very well. It was rough to the touch but incredibly functional. Often, another fur skin was thrown over the woolen blanket, fur side down. This sandwich, a hay mattress, a skin under the back, a wool blanket, and a skin on top, created a real thermos. It captured the body's heat and prevented it from dissipating. Pillows also existed. They were stuffed with feathers, down, or the same straw. They supported the head and neck during sleep. This entire system was breathable. Wool and fur allowed moisture to escape from the body, preventing the sleeper from getting damp. This was critically important, as a damp body freezes much faster. What I'm about to show you was the main secret to survival, which cost almost nothing. It was the principle of communal sleeping. Even the best fur cocoon cannot keep you as warm as the warmth of another person. The entire extended family lived in a long house. There could be dozens of people. The head of the household with his wife, their adult relatives, workers, and they all slept on shared platforms. People went to bed side by side. It was not a matter of comfort, but of survival. Several bodies under one large blanket generated and retained heat much more efficiently than one person. Such communal sleeping was the absolute norm. It allowed them to save resources. Instead of trying to heat 10 separate beds, they heated one common area. Of course, there was a certain hierarchy. The most honorable and warmest places, usually in the center of the platform, away from the entrance, were occupied by the head of the house and his immediate family. Guests or workers could sleep closer to the edges or in less prestigious parts of the house. But the principle itself remained unchanged. Sleeping alone on a polar night was not a luxury, but a danger. This method was so effective that it was also used on expeditions. Warriors on a halt slept huddled together under one large canopy or cloak. Psychologically, this was also important. Sleeping side by side with fellow tribesmen gave a sense of security and community. It helped them endure the oppressive darkness and howling blizzard outside the walls. It was a social and thermal necessity. But how did they solve the obvious problem of personal space in such conditions? In the next chapter, we will examine how the Vikings managed to share these communal beds. Although the sleeping platforms in the longhouse were shared, this did not mean that everyone slept in one shapeless heap. On the contrary, even in such a cramped and communal space, there were clear boundaries and simple but effective ways of dividing personal areas. These boundaries were not just physical. They reflected both the internal order of the family and the ideas of the people of that time about personal space and status. Each small family, husband, wife, sometimes a child or servant, had its own section of the platform. Removable wooden partitions were used to separate it from the neighbors. These were vertical boards inserted into special grooves in the flooring. They could be put up in a matter of minutes and removed just as quickly. As a result, the sleeping area was transformed into a kind of compartment, similar to a small cabin. These partitions were not all the same. In poor families, they were simple boards, often roughly hewn with an axe. In the homes of noble people, the partitions were decorated with carvings, patterns, runic symbols, and intertwining lines. They could depict scenes from myths, animals, or simply symbols of protection. In this way, even in sleep, people surrounded themselves with familiar talismans. The function of these wooden walls was not only symbolic, they served as real protection from the cold and wind. Drafts in a long house were common, especially near the doors. But the partitions created a closed space in which the air was warmed by the breath and bodies of those sleeping. The temperature difference could reach several degrees. It seemed like a trifle, but in the conditions of a northern winter, it meant everything. Inside such a box, it was warmer, drier, and quieter. It was a small house inside a large house, a personal warm cave amid the icy darkness. In addition to wooden walls, curtains were also used. Heavy woolen or linen fabrics hung from the ceiling beams. They served several purposes at once. They shielded the sleepers from prying eyes, retained heat, and softened sounds. Sometimes these curtains were embroidered with simple patterns or braid. Their color depended on the family's wealth. Gray, brown, and dark blue were the most common. At night, these curtains were lowered, turning the platform into a cozy niche. In the semi-darkness, the coals of the hearth burned, and the light from them shone through the fabric, creating a soft flicker of shadows. Inside, it was warm, quiet, and safe. One can imagine someone tossing and turning under a rough skin, with children snoring nearby. Everything in this space breathed peace. During the day, on the contrary, life came alive. The curtains were pulled back or removed altogether, and the wooden partitions were taken out of their grooves and placed against the wall. The longhouse was once again transformed into a single hall, noisy, lively, and full of activity. Here they ate, spun yarn, repaired equipment, and discussed the news. Children ran through the passageway, men discussed hunting, and women dried clothes by the hearth. In this way, the space of the house was flexible and mobile, like living fabric. It could change depending on the time of day and the needs of the family. During the day, it was a common space where life bustled and mingled. At night, it was a warm structure of separate cells, each belonging to its own small group. This system amazingly combined collectivity and personal space. The Vikings lived side by side, hearing their neighbors breathe, but at the same time they had their own corner, their own little zone of warmth and peace. This reflected their worldview. They were part of a clan, a community, a ship's crew, but even within the collective, each person had their own place, their own boundaries, their own silence. But what about bedding? Even the most reliable wooden platform and curtain do not make a place soft and cozy. What did the harsh people of the north use to cover these niches? What did they wrap themselves in? What did they sleep on? In the next chapter, we will look under the skins and find out how comfort was created in an era when there were no mattresses or pillows as we understand them. The main enemy of warmth in a longhouse was not the frost itself, nor the endless winds carrying snow from the fjords, but the draft, an invisible but merciless killer of comfort. Even if the hearth burned all day, one wrong movement of the door could instantly cool the room. Cold air penetrated inside, moved across the floor, seeped between the boards, and instantly took away the accumulated heat. The problem was compounded by the fact that the long Viking house had two entrances, sometimes located at opposite ends, sometimes both on one long side. This was convenient. One entrance led to the living area, the other to the utility area, where livestock was kept and supplies were stored. But each of them was a potential breach in the defense against the cold. Opening the door in winter meant literally letting the north into the house. A stream of icy air rushed in with a noise, knocking down the flames in the hearth and causing smoke to spread throughout the room. The hot coals crackled, the flames subsided, and a wave of cold immediately swept through the house. Several such openings a day, and all the work of heating was wasted. Therefore, the Vikings came up with a surprisingly thoughtful solution: a thermal lock, or, as we would say today, a vestibule. It was not just an architectural element, but a vital detail without which the house could not function in winter. A small room, called a vestibule, was built outside the entrance. It was a narrow, dark, unheated corridor where wet clothes, boots, and tools could be left. There were jugs and ropes there, and sometimes dried herbs or nets hung from the ceiling. When someone entered, they first opened the outer door, entered this buffer area, closed the door tightly behind them, shook off the snow, caught their breath from the wind, and only then opened the inner door. This system seemed simple, but it was precisely what saved the house from cooling down. The Vikings, observant and practical, understood the principle of an air cushion. Between the two doors, the air remained relatively warm, creating a natural barrier. Even in strong winds, only a small amount of cold air entered the room. This reduced heat loss by almost 90%. The doors in the longhouse were massive and heavy. They were made of thick planks held together with iron brackets or leather straps. The wood was chosen to be dense, oak, ash, sometimes spruce. To prevent them from warping from moisture, they were coated with fat or resin. The hinges creaked, but each door closed with a dull, confident thud, like a barrier from the outside world. The doors were often lined with bear, sheep, or deer skins on the inside. This not only provided insulation, but also muffled the sound of the wind. Some families also hung heavy wool curtains on the doorways to prevent even the smallest gaps from letting in the cold. Inside the house, dealing with drafts was a constant concern. Women would check the walls and roof daily to see if any new cracks had appeared. Any holes were immediately caulked with moss, tow, shreds of wool, or even pieces of old fabric. In winter, this was a matter of survival, not convenience. Inside the house, dealing with drafts was a constant concern. Women would check the walls and roof daily to see if any new cracks had appeared. Any holes were immediately caulked with moss, tow, shreds of wool, or even pieces of old fabric. In winter, this was a matter of survival, not convenience. Sometimes the cracks were temporarily plugged, during a gust of wind, until it got warmer. During heavy snowstorms, you could see snow penetrating inside in tiny whirlwinds, and then slowly melting on the floor. In such cases, the Vikings simply nailed down an extra board or covered the vulnerable spot with skins. Particular attention was paid to the bottom of the doors, where the wind penetrated most strongly. To stop it, rolled up rags, bags of wool, or dry grass were placed under the door. It seemed like a small thing, but even such a barrier could save the house from the morning cold. All these measures created a kind of multi-level protection system. First, there was the outer porch, then the massive door, then the curtain, and behind it, the warmth of the hearth and sleeping platforms along the walls. This order had been refined over years of observation and experience. Every detail, from a tuft of moss in a crack to door hardware, was part of the struggle for warmth and survival. The Vikings did not build at random. Their houses were designed like living organisms, adapted to breathe the northern winds. And if a house survived its 10th winter, it meant that every door, every crack, and every skin on the wall had been placed correctly. But even perfect airtightness did not save them from another scourge: moisture. The heat was retained, but the air inside became heavy and damp, especially after cooking and drying clothes. How did the Vikings ventilate their homes without losing precious heat? More on that in the next chapter. The polar night is not just the absence of the sun. It is a special state of the world when darkness becomes dense, almost material. It weighs on your shoulders and presses on your mind. Outside the windows is endless blackness, from which even the silhouettes of the mountains cannot be seen. The wind moans in the cracks. The snow creaks somewhere behind the wall, and it seems as if the world around has frozen. In such conditions, survival depended not only on heat, but also on light, on the ability to somehow dispel the darkness in order to preserve sanity and a sense of life. The main source of light, of course, remained the central hearth, the heart of the longhouse. Its long flames flickered and danced on the walls, casting bizarre shadows on the carved wooden beams and people's faces. The fire enlivened the house. The crackling of the logs was the sound of life, and the glare of the flames transformed the dark hall into a warm, flickering refuge. When the fire died down, it seemed as if the whole world outside the walls was closing in and about to swallow this tiny island of light. The light from the hearth was enough for everyday life: cooking, talking, caring for children, mending clothes. But as soon as a person sat down to one side, a little further from the flames, everything around them was plunged into semi-darkness. And if they needed to work, sewing, spinning, cutting wood, or weaving nets, this light became desperately insufficient. That's when lamps came into play, simple and ingenious at the same time. The Vikings made them from whatever was at hand. In coastal areas, they used steatite, a soft soapstone that is easy to carve. In other places, they used clay, sometimes simply forming a bowl with their hands. They poured fish oil inside, thick, smelly, but a valuable source of light. In the north, every drop of fat was obtained through hard work. It was rendered from cod liver, walrus blubber, and the remains of marine mammals. This fat was not only food, but also fuel and medicine. The wick was made from whatever materials were available: twisted moss, scraps of wool, pieces of fabric, or plant fibers. One end was placed on the edge of a bowl, while the other absorbed the fat. When lit, it produced a quiet, steady flame, tiny but lively. It burned for a long time, smoldering and emitting a slight smell of fat, but it allowed work to continue even in the deepest night. Such lamps were placed on low tables, on shelves near sleeping places, and sometimes hung on chains under beams. By their light, women mended clothes, men repaired tools, and children listened to stories from their elders. It was not just light. It was a continuation of human presence in the darkness. Each lamp illuminated its own little world: a patch of wall, a bowl of food, hands working on a pattern. Sometimes, on particularly long and dark nights, several lamps were lit at once, one on each side of the house. Then the hall seemed to come alive. Hundreds of shadows moved on the walls, metal objects glistened, and the fire reflected in people's eyes. These faint lights created the illusion that life was still going on, that morning would come someday. But even at such moments, light remained a precious commodity. Fish oil was not wasted. Every drop was worth the effort and time. The lamps were lit only when the darkness became unbearable. Sometimes the Vikings sat in almost complete darkness, relying only on the glow of the coals. They spoke quietly so as not to disturb the night and listened to the crackling of the oil in the lamp. Light in the longhouse was not just a physical phenomenon, it had psychological significance. It kept people from despair and gave them a sense of control over the world. When everything around is plunged into darkness, even a small flame becomes a symbol of hope. The fire said, "We are alive, the house is breathing, the night has not yet won." Thus, oil lamps and hearths served not only as sources of light and heat, but also as a support for the human spirit. Their flame united the family, made the darkness softer and winter shorter. After all, in conditions where the sun does not appear for weeks, the ability to preserve light was one of the most important virtues. But what happened when even this light faded and the house was plunged into complete darkness? How did the Vikings cope with nights when the wind howled and the fire had long since gone out? More on this in the next chapter. Survival during the polar night was not only a physical challenge, but also a psychological one. Spending several months in a dark, confined, smoky, and crowded space is incredibly stressful. However, the social structure of the Vikings turned this disadvantage into an advantage. The longhouse was not a prison, but the center of social life. When work outside stopped, life inside was in full swing. It was a time to strengthen social ties. The warmth of the hearth and shared daily life brought people together. The long, dark evenings were a time for stories. Skalds and simply good storytellers recited sagas about heroes, gods, and great expeditions. These stories were not just entertainment. They were oral history, a code of honor, and a textbook of life. They reminded people in the dark hall of their great heritage and that spring always follows winter. People did not sit idle. Women gathered around the fire with spinning wheels and looms. Men repaired weapons and tools and carved intricate patterns out of wood or bone. This monotonous, meditative work calmed the mind. It prevented people from sinking into depression due to the lack of sunlight. The house hummed with quiet conversations, laughter, and the sounds of craftsmanship. They played board games. Archaeologists have found many pieces and boards for the game Hnefataf, or royal checkers. These intellectual contests brightened the long hours. The ritual of sleep itself was collective. People went to bed together and woke up together. This shared rhythm of life prevented anyone from feeling isolated. Thus, the longhouse was not just a shelter. It was a social mechanism that prevented the community from falling apart under the pressure of darkness and cold. The polar night was not a time of death, but a time of culture, craftsmanship, and community. A Viking's sleep during the polar night was not passive rest, as it is for us. It was an active, thoughtful, and collective survival strategy. Every element of their daily life, from the turf roof to the wool blanket, was part of a unified system, honed over centuries. Architecture, materials, and social habits worked together. They created a warm, safe, and psychologically comfortable space in the heart of an icy world. The Vikings did not just endure winter, they learned to live in it. What other aspects of Viking or other ancient cultures would you like to explore? Suggest topics for future videos in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the past.